Hey everyone, welcome to Drinkers and Thinkers, Episode 5. My name's Dan, and I'll be dragging you through some content over the next hour. I'm playing the peppy music up front. It seems a little bit incongruous with what's going on in the world, but I figured for consistency's sake and posterity's sake, we're going to play the music, for better or worse. So there it is. Obviously, we know what's on our mind this week, and it's kind of inescapable, so we're going to spend some time on it. But we do have an interview today with Melanie DeRigo, who's running in a Democratic primary in New York's 3rd District. And we have a nice conversation, she and I. This was a good time. And she talks about her experience running for the first time and some policy stuff. I'm going to give this disclaimer now, and I'll give it later. These interviews are pre-recorded. They're recorded in batches. So this interview was done about 3 or 4 weeks ago in anticipation of releasing it today. So there is no talk in the interview of George Floyd or of the protests going on or anything like that. So that may seem like some cognitive dissonance going on, but it's just because the recording was done 3 or 4 weeks ago. So that's the story on that. As always, reach out to us on our email, thedrinkersandthinkers@gmail.com. And to further confuse you, you can check out our website under construction, which is drinkersthinkers.com. Find us on Facebook, find us on YouTube, leave a review, hopefully a good one, but if you leave a bad one, I'll probably get angry and reply, so that might be fun, because the internet is a wonderful tool, as we've seen. And I think that's it out of me. Oh, next week in our interview segment, we're going to have a few guests on, and we're going to talk about immigration. Not so much policy, but the immigration experience in America, what it's like to come here. And we've sort of picked a group of people that reflect coming here in different stages of life and for different reasons and from different countries. So that should be an interesting conversation. And if anything changes, given current events, I might be more on top of that next week. We might push that if, something else goes wrong in America. So I think that's it from me. Please enjoy Episode 5. Thanks so much. Well, I think the thing that I'm looking at right now is what we'll go with first, and that is this use or thinking about using the Insurrection Act to send the military to put down all of this unrest. Wow, that's very fascist of you. So what is the Insurrection Act? Well, it dates, it's pre-Civil War. I think there's some confusion about that. It predates the Civil War by quite a bit. It's actually America's favorite schizophrenic, Thomas Jefferson, gave us the Insurrection Act. And I say that because I can't... Thomas Jefferson is a very difficult person to figure out. Here's an ardent defender of states' rights, and yet he signs the Insurrection Act into law. But okay, it's also been amended several times through its life cycle, and that one of them was post-Civil War, and that amendment actually becomes ironic here. So the idea is that the president could use the Insurrection Act to either federalize the National Guard, which we've seen before during disasters, but not through use of the Insurrection Act, or to send U.S. troops to a state. And this is to quell uprisings and rebellions and civil unrest. Now, there are some provisions here. The first way it could happen, and the easiest, I'd imagine, is if the governor of a state requests the help. Then it becomes sort of pro forma, and you can't really argue the use of it. If a governor asks for it, then there you have it, I suppose. But the president can force this upon states, and that's actually one of the things that has been amended about the law throughout the years, is that the president can force troops into a state, even if a governor refuses. That would create an awfully interesting situation, I'd imagine, in certain states. Now, we're looking obviously at the civil unrest side of this, because there is no true insurrection here. There's no rebellion against state authority, and there's no rebellion or sedition against the federal government. I'm not saying that those wouldn't be good things. I'm just saying that they don't apply here. So we're talking only about civil unrest right now. And frankly, there's something in the original law that says that you use this if it becomes impractical to enforce laws. Law enforcement is not impractical right now. Now, law enforcement itself is doing a terrible job. I can speak to New York City. And I'll blame the police here, but also blame the political leadership. The political leadership has sort of absolved themselves of any wrongdoing as when it comes to how the police conduct themselves throughout this period of civil unrest. But they can't get away with that. De Blasio and Cuomo have both thrown the NYPD under the bus, and that's not entirely fair. These guys should be excoriated in public because they're useless. I mean, de Blasio is that's a whole other that's a whole episode, or not, because I don't even want to give him any attention because he's not due any. But anyway, I digress. The police are responsible here as well for a complete lack of a plan, the complete lack of execution. Now, specifically, the Bronx is burning every night, and windows are being smashed and things are being stolen, cars lit on fire. I have friends in the Bronx. I have friends who live on Fordham Road, and there are no cops in sight for a lot of the night. There are no cops anywhere. And I mentioned it's worth mentioning because I live in a pretty residential part of New York City. It's a pretty quiet block. It's a gentrified neighborhood. No bones about that. It is. But there's also no real big commercial district. So there's no, stores to loot unless you're going to loot Starbucks. So this has been completely quiet for my neighborhood. We haven't seen anything. Not a protest during the day, not a broken window at night, nothing. I took a picture this morning, just sort of as a wry joke. There was one of those big orange traffic barrels, and it looks like it had been run over at some point during the night and lying in the middle of the street. So I took a picture to show, the absolute devastation that has been wrought upon my neighborhood. But anyway, given that, I look out of my apartment during curfew, and there are 22, I counted them, there are 22 New York City Police Department officers standing on the street corner all night watching traffic go by. Now, I imagine there are other such useless intersections in New York City where there are 20 cops hanging out. It occurs to me that the city would probably be better served if those guys were standing somewhere in the Bronx, perhaps, or lower Manhattan where there were mass protests after curfew. It doesn't seem like the city is served by having them here. And the response has been chaotic at best. And, not for nothing, and they brought this upon themselves, but the NYPD has a history. They are not below throttling down and throttling up their effectiveness to make a point. They've done this before, where they consciously decide not to enforce the law quite as well, just to make a political point. That may be what's going on here, because there's this cockfight between the governor and the police and the mayor and the police and the governor and the mayor, and it's a mess. So I don't know why they're unable to get a handle on this, but they're not. And there are obviously other cities that are enduring this, but the reality remains it's not impractical to enforce the law. As the Insurrection Act requires, it's not impractical to enforce the law. They're just not doing a very good job, which is fine because they generally don't do a very good job. So there's nothing abnormal here. So this Insurrection Act doesn't apply in this sense. It's a useless fucking gesture towards Donald Trump's base. It's a tin pot strongman hiding in a bunker trying to appear strong. And I also believe maliciously trying to hurt people. That's the goal here. It's not just to appear strong. There's something in him that just really wants to inflict pain and damage. This is just his MO. So, Insurrection Act, invalid. Here's the irony of the Insurrection Act, and here's where it really hurts. It actually does. As I've said, it's been amended through the years, and the latest amendment was after the Civil War. The Insurrection Act is there so that the federal government can ensure that people's civil rights are protected. In southern states, for instance, if police forces and local authorities refused to protect black families, refused to quell violence against black people, the Insurrection Act would allow the federal government to step in and be the law enforcement that is otherwise absent, to be the guarantor of those people's civil rights in lieu of their local governments. The last time it was used, to my knowledge, was when Eisenhower used the Insurrection Act to force certain states to integrate their schools. So something that sounds pretty terrible, the Insurrection Act, actually in recent usage has been something fairly noble. Now, I don't think the federal government should have this power. Not for a noble cause, not for Donald Trump. They shouldn't have this power. The U.S. military should never be on the ground in an American city. And we're talking now robustly in public about defunding the police. Well, let's also defund our military quite a bit. The military should never be on the ground in an American city. Ever. Period. And in fact, it's never been put to the test. And again, some of that is because the reasons for it, its use recently, have been more noble. It's never been put to the test, but it is a absolutely unconstitutional statute. It's a suspension in part of habeas corpus, which, and we discussed this last week with Jim Black, that's been struck down by the courts. You can't selectively suspend habeas corpus. You cannot selectively suspend provisions of our Constitution. Even emergency powers, we talked about this last week, emergency powers are subject to the Constitution of the United States and the states. They can't be suspended. So all of these tactics, the ones that have been used and the ones that Donald Trump wants to use, they're all legally dubious. They all would be struck down in normal times. They all would be struck down in court. It's very convenient that the courts aren't, open right now. But the Insurrection Act is just completely invalid. And I'm truly torn between whether or not he's just putting on a show, and this is a very effective tool for that, or he really believes that he has this power and that this is the way. I don't know which. But it's horrifying to think that the president's judgment is that poor either way. But all that dust in the bunker gets to your brain sometimes. It clouds your mind. No, don't laugh. Don't laugh. It's not, I can't imagine the feeling being down there, knowing that your wife and kids are, 3 feet away from you in a reinforced concrete bunker, keeping you safe from sign-wielding maniacs. I can imagine the fear that he must experience down there. And it's not about Donald Trump. It's not about politics. It's about humanity, folks. The man is down there. He's in the basement. It's not even a basement. It's a sub-basement. He's below the below. You know how scary that must be? To not be able to talk to anyone else except by encrypted satellite phones? To not be able to reach the outside world except through Twitter? It's scary. Imagine if he had no signal down there. Imagine if the Wi-Fi went out. It's fine now to express your hatred towards Trump, but just imagine if that Wi-Fi ran out. You couldn't summon the feelings of pity. You couldn't bring yourself in a human gesture to put your arm around Donald and say, it'll be okay, partner. We're going to be fine. Think about him. What a terrible ordeal he's been through. I can't even talk about it. I think about his wife, who was left somewhere in the White House, not in the bunker with him, but I'm sure that was an oversight. What a piece of shit. Oh, boy. All right, let's move on. Okay, so this is news out of the Bronx and Westchester. Elliot Engel, who's a 1,000-term congressman that represents Westchester and parts of the Bronx, was caught on a hot mic. We love hot mics, don't we? Was caught on a hot mic at an event, I guess, in the Bronx. He was talking to Ruben Diaz Jr., who's the Bronx borough president. He's also the son of a bigot, I might add, but that's neither here nor there. And Elliot Engel is on a hot mic begging him for time to speak to the crowd about the killing of George Floyd. And he said, and I'm quoting, "I wouldn't care if I didn't have this primary." End quote. I wouldn't care if I didn't have this primary. Oh, so he does indeed have a primary. This is New York 16th District. He's running... I guess one of his opponents dropped out, so he's just running against a gentleman, Jamal Bowman, and you can find him on the internet and donate to his campaign so we can get Mr. Engel out of the seat that he's been camping out for the last 30-plus years. Now, in his defense, someone told me that he was named the most effective legislator of blah, blah, blah. You know, that's like saying you're the fastest toddler. Effective legislator? The legislature isn't effective. The Congress isn't effective. They have an approval rating of about 3%. On an island full of morons, a moron is going to be king. But he's still a moron. I have no use for Elliot Engel or his ilk. This is another. He's 70-plus years old. He's closer to 80. This is another septuagenarian, octogenarian. 30-plus years on this seat is enough! It's enough for 3 lifetimes! This is a man who's been criticized for spending no time in his district during this primary process, during the corona crisis. This was, by the way, his district includes New Rochelle, the epicenter of New York's corona outbreak. New Rochelle is where it started. He's been nowhere to be found. This is why Joe Crowley is no longer with us. This is why, hopefully, Mr. Engel will no longer be a part of this process. This is why, hopefully, Mr. Swazi will go down in a few weeks. This has to end. We can argue for term limits, but we are empowered to limit these people. We're empowered to show up and say, you know what? Those 2 years are going to be your last. Because the police continue to kill black people in the street unchecked. Because we continue to wage war on the world unchecked. Those 2 years should be your last. Because we continue to allow Americans to starve, and Americans to struggle, and Americans to get sick and die without any help or aid. Those 2 years should be your last in Congress. We're empowered to limit these people's terms, and we don't do it. Everyone likes their own congressman, but then everyone hates Congress. They're part of the problem. Elliot Engel is part of the problem. He was there when they destroyed the post office. He was there when we waged war in Iraq and Afghanistan. He was there when the wheels came off those endeavors, and yet they kept throwing money at it and kept throwing money at it and kept throwing money at it. He was there for all of these moments. This guy has led an insignificant, ignominious life in Congress for 36-something years. Enough's enough. I wouldn't care if I didn't have this primary. Who expresses that? What kind of person expresses? He was so desperate to put his white face in front of a crowd who is hurting because of the treatment of minorities. He was so desperate to put his old wrinkled-ass white face in front of the crowd that he would even express that thought verbally. Who does that? You forget privilege. This is not privilege. This is the idea of impunity. This is the idea that you are in a certain place from which you can never be taken away from. You will never be taken off that hill. Because for 30-something years, he hasn't been. And for 110 years, Nancy Pelosi hasn't been. And for 50 years, Mitch McConnell hasn't been. And for these guys don't go away unless you send them away. Cut out the tumors. It's time. Lindsey Graham, it's time. And I could go through Congress. The average age of Congress is like 204. You can go through Congress, and if you if you just forcibly retire every member over the age of 70, there'd be no one left. We'd have about 16 people in Congress. And if you cut out people in their 60s, there'd be 4 people there. Now, is this an ageist thing? Oh my God, he's an ageist. No, it's not an ageist thing, except that they're out of touch. And here's the problem. When you're 78 years old and in Congress, it's pretty likely that that means you've been in Congress for decades. I don't think anyone decides to run for Congress at 73 years old. You've been there for decades. Your time is up. Your time has come because the things that you were passionate about and that you spoke passionately about in 1932 when you were first elected are no longer relevant today. And you've learned nothing else about the world you live in because you've been cloistered in a different place than the rest of us for the last few decades. You have learned nothing else about the world because you haven't been required to live in the world. These guys have got to go. Jamal Bowman, go find him on the internet. Donate to his campaign. If you live in Westchester and the Bronx, it is vital that a new voice be heard. Any voice. Any voice is better than a non-voice. And this guy is a non-entity. And again, even if you give him the benefit of the doubt from a moral standpoint, and say, I'm sure he didn't mean it, I'm sure he wasn't being malicious, and I'm sure he doesn't not care about, police brutality, even if you give him the benefit of the doubt, why do you want your congressman to be so defective so as to have a lack of judgment that huge that you would express that idea? Do you know how stupid you have to be to say something like that? Elliot does now, I suppose. Had enough. It's time. I want to form a political movement. The slogan will be, it's time. And our job will just be ejecting people from Congress. Just ejecting them. Just jettison them out the airlock after they've served maybe 3 terms. Enough's enough. Enough's enough. I'm really happy now that we're going to have a chat with Melanie DeRigo. Melanie is running for Congress. She's running in a primary in New York's 3rd District. This is her first time running for office, and she's going to talk with us about some of the challenges of that, some of the experiences she's had, and also discuss some policy positions, most notably how she differs from her rather apathetic opponent. So I'm thrilled that it brings Melanie to the show. Hi, Melanie. How are you?
I'm doing well, Dan. How are you?
As well as can be expected in quarantine.
I understand.
So you are running for Congress in New York's 3rd District. You're running in a primary against an incumbent who's basically camping on a blue seat right now. What prompted you to run for Congress? Was this a slow burn, something you always wanted to do, or was there an inciting incident?
Yeah, I was definitely not something that I thought was in my future. It wasn't in my grand plan. But I think for me, it was an evolutionary process. When Trump was elected, I was not one of those people, and I don't know if you were, Dan, who knew that was going to happen. We all have those friends that said, I knew that was happening. I did not know that was going to happen. I was caught very much off guard. And I had always been, of course, politically active and engaged in my community. But, at the time I was pregnant with my 3rd child. I had 2 little children in the house. And like most young families, we were working on, getting ahead in our careers and changing diapers and making sure our kids had all their needs met. And I realized in that moment that I wasn't doing enough. I wasn't paying attention enough. And I'm a scientist. I have a master's of science. So, as a scientists do, we try to come up with a theory and then build a plan around it. So I figured at the time, if I could involve myself more in my community, if I could engage more community members, we could potentially combat Trump's hateful agenda. And so that's what I started doing. I started stepping up in organizations that I was previously involved in, with like Planned Parenthood and Moms Demand Action. And I started seeking out new organizations to see how I could be helpful and supportive to community members. A lot of immigrant rights groups. I helped organize the Women's March in Atlanta in 2018 and started organizing protests. And from there, I started working to elect Democrats. I had this, what now I look back on and I say, well, a very naive and perhaps even silly notion that the way to combat the Trump agenda, the way to combat agendas that try to squash marginalized folks, is to elect Democrats. I learned that the hard way, that what we really need to do is elect better Democrats.
Yes.
And so through my quest of, volunteering for campaigns, I managed as a volunteer my state assemblyman's reelection campaign. I volunteered extensively on my state senator's campaign. I was making calls for candidates all over the country. I chased ballots for Stacey Abrams, and kind of through this process, I started to feel a little bit better about myself. I was engaging with the community. I was bringing more people in. I was becoming more educated myself. And then Brett Kavanaugh was nominated to the Supreme Court. And I'm a survivor of sexual assault. So for me, it really hit me pretty hard. I had gone down to DC twice to protest in two different occasions. The last time I went down was the day of the final vote, where we knew he was going to get confirmed. But I brought my whole family with me because I wanted my little girls, who had just turned 8 and 4, and my son, who was in a stroller at that time. I wanted them to be there. I knew that, Brett Kavanaugh would loom over their lifetime. And I wanted them to know that their parents were on the front lines fighting for them. And I wanted them to know that they could be on the front lines fighting for themselves. And that was a really pivotal moment for me, because I always describe it as something inside me kind of shifted or snapped or, maybe awoken. I know I should have felt completely just without hope, complete despair. But as I looked around that day, I was standing at the foot of the Supreme Court, and I'm looking around and I'm angry, right? I'm angry because I'm holding my little girl's hands in mine, and I'm thinking to myself, how could we let this happen? But looking around, I saw people, thousands of people from all over the country, supporting each other, consoling each other, chanting, lifting each other up. And I think, this is not, this experience is not just unique to me, but I think it's a collective experience that we all share for folks who did go down to Kavanaugh and protest. I think these seeds were planted that day, that it was going to take a lot more than just helping Democrats get elected. It was going to take a lot more than just showing up and supporting different community groups. It was going to take a lot more from all of us. And I knew in that moment that I would have to give more to my community and my country if I wanted a better future for not only my children, but for all of our children. And I didn't know for sure that I would be running for Congress that day, but I think that's the moment that things started to change. When I came back to New York, I realized that my now opponent, was completely silent on the Kavanaugh hearings. And I thought that was odd, because he professes to be a women's rights champion. And the more I looked and the more I dug, I realized I had a representative that wasn't representing me. And we can talk about this more. Don't go into every detail right now, but from everything from, immigration, women's rights, the environment, healthcare, it just wasn't adding up. It didn't seem like he was representative of democratic ideals. And in fact, the day I made my final decision was when I went to one of his town halls. It was just after the emergency border aid funding bill was passed. I don't know if you remember this, at the end of June last year. It was about a $4.6 billion spend. My now opponent stood in front of all of his constituents and said, "Don't worry, it's terrible what's going on down there, but we fixed it. We're sending money so they have things like food and water and medical supplies." But what really happened, and I know this because I read the damn bill, a lot of the protections that were initially put in this bill were stripped out by Mitch McConnell. When that bill was sent back to the House, the Problem Solvers Caucus, of which my representative is the vice chair of, went to Pelosi and said, "We are not going to vote for Mitch. We're not going to vote for your bill. We're only voting for Mitch McConnell's bill." what that bill really did, over half of the amount of money, and it went toward expanding detention centers. Very, very little went to guaranteed humanitarian aid. In fact, only 3% of it did. And so I challenged my opponent on it because I was really mad. I'm a mom of three, and it's heartbreaking what's going on and what continues to go on at the border. And he said to me, "Oh, I think you misread it. Bills are really hard to read." So yes, let's table for a side that he was essentially patting my head and telling me that bills were too difficult for perhaps a woman to read. But the more I pushed on him, it was almost like if I said to you, Dan, "Well, the sky is blue," and you said, "No, it's not," right? And it was that ridiculous. And so I said to him, like, it just blurted it out. I said, "Did you even read the bill?" And this was just, we were in a small group and other people heard this, and he started stammering and he said, "Well, I said, "Did you read it?" And his chief of staff quickly ran over and he's like, "Well, I read the executive summary." His chief of staff tried to interject. I said, "Did you read it?" And his chief of staff said, "Well, I read the executive summary." And I said, "Gentlemen, do not argue with me about what is in the bill when only one of us read it." And that was the moment. People of course had been urging me to run, but that was the moment that I said, wow, the bar is that low that we have representatives that can't even be bothered to read a bill when actual human lives are at stake. And I didn't feel like I had a choice at that moment. I had to jump in and run.
It seems so easy for especially a congressperson to get lost in a group of 400. They can duck and cover for years and camp on these seats. So I'm with you. I think it's criminal. The inaction of, I think, most members of Congress, regardless of party. These guys and gals are just hiding in crowds, and it's only the few loud voices of dissent that are towing a line of rationality at this point. I'm going to come back to some policy stuff, but you've mentioned, of course, you're a mother of three. What is that discussion like? You've made a decision to run. What is that discussion with your family? How do they react? Because this is obviously now a full-time job.
Yes.
Running for Congress.
Yes. Well, my husband, my partner in everything, he for a long time had been pushing me to run, before I even thought of it as potentially even somewhat based in reality. As I said, this was not part of my plan. I was very content trying to help elect Democrats, in fact. So he was probably on board or way longer, or way earlier than I was with this whole decision. But when I did decide to think about it, like to really seriously consider going for it, I have little children. My daughters they're 9 and 5, and my son is now 3. We've had a couple of birthdays now since, I first launched. But I sat down my daughters because my son doesn't really, understand being so little. My oldest is 9, and I knew that she would understand it the most. And so I explained to her, what mommy was thinking of doing, and I asked her what she thought of it. And I explained to her that it would mean that mommy would have to, live in DC for a few days each week while we're in Congress in session. And I said, "Would you be okay with that?" And she looked at me and she said, "Does that mean that on some weeks I'll be able to come with you?" And I said, "Yeah, of course that's what that means." And she said, "And can we get ice cream?" And I said, "Of course we can get ice cream." And so she said, "Yes, mommy, then I think you should do it." And, my little one, who's 5, she's adorable. And, we talk a lot about issues in my household. We talk to my children about the importance of healthcare and the importance of saving the environment. So this is top of mind to them. And the last several years, I had been organizing protests and managing campaigns, and my kids were along for the ride. These kids are super woke. They know who their state senator is. They know their state assembly person. They canvass all the time. They've gone to large protests and rallies. Like, this is sort of par for the course. But my little 5-year-old tells everyone, "Well, my mommy is running to stop the oceans from rising." And I think it's, they kind of get it, and they're actually really excited about it. We had very honest conversations about what it would mean, and how, how our time would be split. And I think, this leads to something else that's really important. We do need more moms in Congress. Only 5% of Congress right now are moms. And I think we need to create a structure that makes it easier for moms and parents in general to allow for their children to be in two places at once. And you know this, but child actors, we figure it out with child actors. We have to be able to figure it out with situations like this. And I think if we can create a process that makes it easier, we may have more moms running. And I think that would be a real benefit to our country.
Yeah, absolutely. What's been your experience out on the campaign trail? I mean, I see, social media posts. You're at the train stations getting signatures. You're at these luncheons and these meetings. Has your experience been overall hugely positive? Because at least it seems that way. Sort of following your campaign, everyone out there is. This seems very, very positive for you.
It has been, and obviously we're not out in the community right now given the pandemic, but we had started knocking on doors. I want to say maybe in October last year. So thankfully we got a good start. We've been able to knock on thousands and thousands of doors and have really impactful conversations with voters. I went to a lot of community events before deciding to run for office, and so now we've just ramped that up. But I will say that with each conversation we have, it is about educating people, because I think there are folks that are, certainly party loyalists and they know what's going on. There's the activist community that's really cutting through the nonsense and cutting through the BS and really speaking truth to power about what is and is not in certain bills and legislation. But then there's that wide swath in the middle, right? And I think before Trump won, I was in that swath. So I know what that means. We think that because we have a Democratic representative, that representative is fighting for small d democracy, that Democrat is fighting for the ideals of what it means to that person to be a Democrat. And I think historically we've thought that it meant fighting for the people. But we haven't seen that recently, as you mentioned. And having these conversations with people has been just, I mean, I couldn't have asked for it to go better. I was actually surprised at how positive, the response has been. And one of the things that I've said to my team from day one, we're going to win this campaign one living room at a time, because that's how we were campaigning. Whether we're knocking on a door and a voter's inviting us in to have a conversation, or we're having house parties and I'm telling people why I'm running and what I'm fighting for. House after house, living room after living room, we were garnering more and more votes, which is really exciting, both for my election, but also for what that means for the long term, and long-term rebuilding of democracy. So overall, it's been very, very positive.
And I see you're getting a lot of endorsements from community groups and activist groups, which is great. What obviously is absent is support from the party, of course, because this is a primary and this is an incumbent. Have you had interactions with party members, party operatives?
Yes, I have. I think it is a mixed bag. There's the party and there's party leadership and there's committee members. In fact, I'm a committee member. I'm a Nassau County Democratic Committee person. And what I can tell you is that we're sort of at this critical point where there is a changing of the guard starting to happen, where there's certain members of party leadership that push for big money in politics and some other items where I think many Democrats would not agree with. But there are certainly many, many others that consider themselves hardcore Democrats, part of the party, that are looking for a change, that are looking to welcome in young people. We talk a lot about the Democratic Party as being this big tent party. So we have to ask ourselves, why is it that party leadership is willing to let Democrats into that party that vote with Trump, that do not support a woman's right to choose, yet they don't want the progressives who are saying, hey, let's provide health care for everybody, right? So it's an interesting dynamic. And I'll tell you that not everybody in the party agrees with the way party leadership has been steering the ship.
I'd imagine not. Now, I'm not a Democrat. I haven't been for a while, and nothing spurred me to action more than Trump's election and his goon squad. I have a vested interest in the success of the Democratic Party suddenly, which is, I'll be honest, it's uncomfortable at times. I never in my life thought I'd vote for Hillary Clinton, but I did. I'll be voting for Joe Biden. Liz was my choice. Liz was my choice 4 years ago, in fact. But I think Trump has put us all in an interesting position. How does the party move forward. I've had on another Democrat, and I've asked this question. I've also had on a libertarian who I've asked this question of his own party. Is there a struggle for the soul of the Democratic Party? And if so, is it realistic that the old guard, that the big business, big banks, insurance Democrats are going to simply die off one day? Or is this party really going to have to find a way to somehow make the Medicare for all folks coexist with the insurance lobby folks?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to unpack in that particular question. I do think that we are singing. I mean, I hate to use the phrase dying off, but I definitely see that there is a sea change happening, and younger folks do support progressive policies. They want to see humane policies. They want to see Medicare for all. They want a habitable planet to live on. That is not a hard ask from a young person who's looking at their government and saying, why aren't you tackling climate change? So I definitely think that we will have many of those politicians aging out of the system. I don't know how the party reconciles. I know it can be done, but it's going to take work on both sides. I think that this idea that this one person who represents the old way is going to unite without any concessions is probably not realistic. But I do think it is possible to bring in a swath of people, but we need to extend those olive branches, right? That's what coalition building is all about.
Now, I look at the other party, and as disdainful as that party has become, in my view, I look at a party that somehow is unified, even if most of them are seemingly just being held hostage at this point by this hostile takeover of their party. They seem to always be on message. They seem to always be able to rally, to circle the wagons, to outmaneuver. What is it going to take for the Democratic Party to mount a unified, full frontal opposition to what we're seeing right now? How do we reverse the rise of Republicans? Because the numbers from about 2000 on are horrific for Democrats up until the midterm elections when things started to change. But what does the Democratic Party have to do here?
I think it's going to take electing representatives that have courage and conviction and morality and integrity. And sadly, and this of course is in every race, but we're seeing less and less of this in the Democratic Party. You talk about this abysmal, I think that's the word you used, party on the other side, the Republican Party. You're right. They are on message. They follow suit. They follow the leader. I used to think it was because Democrats elected real leaders, and the Republican Party was happy to, select one leader and have everyone else follow that person. And I think, corporate money has become so pervasive on both sides these corporate donors have really become the puppeteers. And so now we're seeing on both sides of the aisle, these representatives be controlled by their donors, and that's how they're legislating right now, right? So I think we need to get rid of corporate money and then allow representatives who actually want to represent their people to lead. I'm not convinced at all because of the evidence, because of the history, what we have seen, that the Democratic Party in its current state is poised to lead on any of these matters because they're answering to their corporate donors. I'm so encouraged by the progressive movement, by these amazing candidates that are running all over this country, that are stepping up and they're saying, no, this is insane. This is what we need to do, and this is what I'm running for. I think we're going to continue to see a progressive swell, particularly as we talked about the older representatives in the party aging out. But look at the last election cycle and how many progressives ran, and then look at this election cycle. We're only poised to continue to grow. We have the passion on our side. We have the integrity, the morality. We have it all on our side, and this is what fires people up. This is what gets people out of bed. My campaign, I've already identified folks that I think are just incredible powerhouses that I want to mentor to run, and I think that's what it's about.
So a big part of your run is the immigration issue. It's the detention centers, these people that are being basically warehoused, separated from families. And you and I largely agree on the immigration issue. I think. I mean, I believe anyone who's here should just simply stay here. We should honor our promise to the dreamers, and everyone should have a route in. I mean, I do believe in numbers and quotas, so that the floodgates don't open all at once. But I think everyone should have a chance to get here. I know that economically speaking, just from a math point of view, our economy was designed only to grow if our population grows. So it only makes sense, I think, for everyone to get on board with this. But that having been said, is immigration a difficult or even losing issue for the Democrats, given how divisive it is, even within the minority communities in your own party?
Yeah, I don't think it's a losing issue at all, simply because it's an issue that needs to be addressed, and it's an issue where human life is at stake. That's never a losing issue, and it's always an admirable fight to take on. Let me just address something that you mentioned, where you said you think we largely agree, but you think that there should be some quotas, a process. I think there is this myth that progressives don't believe there should be a process, and don't believe there should be quotas, that believe that we should just be completely open borders. And I don't really think that's true. In fact, I don't know a single progressive that is advocating for that. Every progressive that I know, and I know quite a few of them, we're advocating for a humane and dignified process, right? Where there is an actual path to citizenship. I mean, right now it can take 20, 30 years to get to become a citizen. And I really think that immigration is designed. The immigration process that we have today is designed as a wedge to separate people, to separate ideologies. Right? We're almost never having the same conversation. Democrats are yelling, "Please stop locking kids in cages. Please stop separating children from their families." And Republicans are getting a completely different set of talking points, and they're saying, "Stop taking our jobs. Well, you should have come here You should have come here legally." Like we're not even addressing the same question, right? So I do think it's important. I think if we could allow for a process that worked, and allow immigrants to come and become citizens and pay into our tax system, I think a lot of that racism and baked in fear goes away, right? Because that's one of the talking points we typically hear. Well, immigrants are mooching off the system, which is not happening. Undocumented folks are struggling, and particularly right now in this pandemic, they're not coming here and getting glamorous jobs. They're coming here and they're doing work that almost no one wants to do, right? So let's give them an opportunity. I mean, all of us, we were having this conversation earlier. What we like about communities, right, or is the diversity, all these different restaurants, all these different activities, and that's what builds community, right? The more immigrants we have, the more diversity we have, the better our communities are. So I do not think this is a losing issue. I just think we need to bring people in and talk about the same aspect of it, right? Because otherwise it becomes a straw man argument.
So I'm going to, before I go on, I'm going to say that I'm using terms that pollsters use, like Latinos, which I believe is a meaningless term because it's not just one block of people voting in one way. That's like saying all whites believe X. That's nonsense. But for the sake of conversation, this is how the polls are sort of framed. And I've got a few things here. This is from New York Times, NPR, and Politico. And out of the three, only Politico kind of tilts right, but not even really. So these are mostly left news sources. Obviously, we know 30% of Latinos voted for Donald Trump. It seems there's a prevailing thought that that's going to be higher in the next election. And numbers as of 2020 say that 65% of registered Latinos who are registered as Democrats approve of the Democratic Party, which means 35% are indifferent or disapprove. I've predicted this for a while in my sort of underground bunker, and people sort of laughed me out of the room. Democrats always talk about shifting demographics and that Texas will turn purple then blue and California's safe forever. Arizona's going to go blue. I have a deep-seated fear that the Democrats do have a problem with their minority voters, that they're not engaged the way they need to be, and that they're going to flee the party. Do you think that there's a problem there? Do you think there's a growing discontent among the Latino community and also the African American voting community?
I'm going to take it a step further. I think that there's growing discontent from people that feel disenfranchised from the party, and that includes everybody. That includes whites, includes Hispanic population, Black population, includes everybody. And I think that is because we have representatives that have really turned their back on helping people. And this goes back to what I said earlier about the influence of corporate money in politics. When we have representatives that legislate for corporations and not people, people don't feel like they have skin in the game. People do not feel like they can rely on their government, right? And so what are they to do? I think if we had representatives that fought for people, that really truly legislated with conviction and legislated because it was the right thing to do, not the politically expedient thing to do, then Donald Trump never would have even been elected, right? These are folks that felt damned if they did and damned if they didn't. So we have a problem in general. And I think if we can start legislating again for people and uplifting everybody, which I believe, and you may disagree with me here, but I believe that that is at the heart of old school Democrats, right? Not old school meaning these insurance corporate backed Democrats, but like the FDR Democrats. That is what I
The
think.
classic liberals.
Yeah,
Classic liberals. Yeah.
that is what we strive for, and I think if we can do that, we will not have an issue. But that's the problem. I don't think it has anything to do with a particular race going one way or the other. I think it's that folks just do not feel that government is working for them.
I would agree that they largely don't. I'm going to just to delve into the demographic thing one more time, specific demographics. My fear in that Latino community stems from the fact that if you eliminate the very hateful rhetoric that the other party has really latched onto, if they simply stopped being mean, my fear is that in that community, they tend to trend more right than they do left on many social issues. Family and religion are the two most important things in those communities. They are not supportive of LGBTQ the way most of America is. They do believe very much in the pull yourself up by the bootstraps. If you work hard, you can do anything message. They seem, if you remove the hateful rhetoric that the other party, for some reason, can't get past, they seem to be ready-made Republican voters. Same in the African-American community, some different issues, but African-Americans have come more and more to abhor taxes because now there are African-Americans that are getting ultra wealthy and, don't want to see their wealth taxed down to nothing. Again, they're not with the left wing of the party on the LGBTQ issues. Again, religion plays a very important part. These seem like very ready-made conservative voters waiting to happen if all things were equal.
Sure. I think it sounds like an organizing problem to me, right? It's an organizing issue that we have to solve. I've run my campaign very issue-based, and I think when you cut out all of those buzzwords, right, that make people feel a certain way, and you just focus on the issue and you have reasonable conversations, I think you get through to people. So yes, you're right. There are certain populations, and there are certain white populations too that skew ultra-religious, and so they may not be.
I agree. My argument is you've already lost them, unfortunately. The party has lost them, and I don't think they're coming back.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I try to give everybody a chance and hope that, we can bring people back and we can bring people together. I think you have to. Maybe it is a little bit optimistic, but I think optimism is really what's needed right now, given, how we're living in a global pandemic under a hateful Trump administration. We need optimistic folks to believe that we can bring people in and we can bring people together and we can work with each other. And I think, talking about the issues, like there are plenty of folks, even in the movement, even in the women's rights movement, right, or women's reproductive rights movement, who believe that, who don't necessarily agree with abortion, but they also understand that it's not their place or their right to tell others what they can and can't do with their bodies, right? And I think this line of thinking is important when we look at it broadly, right? So whether it's LGBTQ issues or, typically when it comes to equality issues, we have to be able to reach people and have those conversations. We can disagree, but it still doesn't give anyone the right to impose their beliefs on someone else. I think we can bring them together. I think we can, bring folks back. And I think there's plenty of other areas where there's more areas where we can agree than disagree.
You talked about a woman's right to choose. It's your body, your choice. It's interesting to me that suddenly an awful lot of rednecks in America seem to feel the same way under quarantine suddenly, that it's their body, their choice. Given that, my question is this: why is it so incredibly difficult to get Americans to simply do the right thing, to simply behave. We're in a quarantine, just stay home and put the guns away just for 12 weeks. Why is every other country in the world, even France, these people, if you look at them funny, start burning down Paris? Okay, why is it so hard for Americans to simply do the right thing and do the sensible thing? What's broken here?
Well, I think the media that they're consuming is playing a huge part of it. Many folks will say, "I'm not influenced by media. I'm not influenced by news sources," but where you consume your news is important. Whether you subscribe to science as fact or science as opinion, which unfortunately we're seeing, in the Republican Party right now. When you have a president that tells people that chloroquine is the way out, chloroquine is the drug that we're going to use to combat COVID-19, and then you have folks taking it and dying. We used to be able to believe our president, right? Even if we didn't agree ideologically with them, we used to look at our president and expect the truth. That is not the case with Donald Trump, and I think anyone who knows how to fact check can see that. But unfortunately, for people that only live in a world where they're consuming ultra right-wing media and ultra right-wing news, they don't see that. They think they are reading the truth. And I think that there is certainly a concerted effort to incite this type of behavior. We saw like what happened in Michigan, where white men basically stormed the Capitol with large guns. And I know this is not new commentary, but if those men had been Black or brown, there would have been a very different response. We see it here in New York, even. We like to think of New York as a very progressive blue state. But we're seeing these protests on Long Island as well, where folks are protesting for their rights. So I think it goes back to that belief I just shared with you, that we have to be able to reach people. We have to be able to have conversations. It doesn't always work, but change is a slow process, right? And we've seen it. We have seen people come around. I have an uncle who voted for Trump, and he and I do not see eye to eye, clearly, ideologically about politics at all. And after this pandemic, and this was at the very beginning of the pandemic, he reached out to me, and we hadn't talked since Thanksgiving. And he reached out to me and he said, I cannot believe how he has handled this situation. I wouldn't like it, but I would even vote for Bernie Sanders over him at this point. So if that could happen, I believe that we can reach anybody.
I'll tell you, the silver lining here is you're absolutely right. I've seen people on social media who have spent years defending Trump, in the most absurd ways, defending the most absurd things. And I have now seen those people who are posting, put the damn mask on and stay home.
Right.
So this has touched a nerve, I think, in a big way. Obviously, there's a lot more work to be done because a lot of folk aren't on board. But, I hope, maybe Darwin will catch up at some point.
Well, you know what they say, right? With behavioral change in general, most folks are not going to act unless something personally affects them, right? So if you're relatively wealthy and relatively privileged, maybe you don't care about immigration, maybe you don't care about women's rights, maybe you don't care about taxes, maybe you don't care about healthcare because you haven't had to worry about it, right? But this is a global pandemic where we all have to worry about it. We know that, of course, wealthier folks are faring well, they're faring better. Than certainly communities where they're living on top of each other. We've seen that in the data. But ultimately, this is such a contagious virus and everybody is at risk and everybody's looking out, right? So this is something that's touching everybody. So I think you're right. There is that opportunity. But I think broadly speaking, once we get through this pandemic, we are going to have such an opportunity to pass meaningful legislation that will impact all Americans. But it's not going to happen unless we elect the right one. So hopefully starting with June, we can get a lot of New York progressive candidates in there.
So my very first episode of this show, I had a biological and environmental research scientist on to talk about coronavirus. And it was a great interview. It was incredibly enlightening. And by the way, he's a fan of yours as well, lives on Long Island in your district. So that's a voter.
Wonderful.
One of the things I discussed with him in that interview is when this is over, obviously there are a lot of lessons to be learned about preparation and taking things seriously. And for me, this goes beyond Trump, the lack of preparation the world had for this sort of thing. But the prevailing thought he had was that we'll learn the lessons sort of in the short term, but long term, this is just going to go away and we're going to make all the mistakes again. Do you think that's the case, that we're going to come out of this guns blazing, kind of like 2008, where we passed these sort of bank reform bills, but they're largely gone now, aren't they? I mean, is this going to just peter out, and are we going to be susceptible to this the next time and the next time?
Well, as you know, history does often repeat itself, right? Look, if we do not start making changes and significant changes, we will continue to see this. We'll continue to see more pandemics as well. Um, I tend to look at the half full glass rather than the half empty glass. And I'm looking at this as, while this is horrible and this is horrific, my husband and I know folks that have passed away personally. Obviously we see the stats, but this virus has affected everybody. It is horrible, but how we move through it and how we rebuild will really define who we are, right? Who we want to be. And there is tremendous, tremendous opportunity. We talk about a Green New Deal, and what do we always hear? Oh, it's impossible. How could we do that? It's not realistic. Well, right now, we're going to have to rebuild our economy. We will lose businesses before this is over. They don't even know when it's going to be safe to start working again. We will have an opportunity to create green new jobs, to build a green new economy, and save our planet for the future. That is a huge, huge win. Right now, more folks are seeing what it's like to not have health insurance, or perhaps they're afraid that they may lose their job and in turn may lose their health insurance in a global pandemic, and perhaps have a little bit more, either whether it's sympathy or maybe it just opens up space for them to consider a universal health care plan. And so the opportunity once we get through this pandemic is tremendous, but we have to fight for it and we have to act on it, and we can't wait. We have to do that now.
Your campaign and your conversation here today is incredibly optimistic. I mean, you're infused with optimism. Do you find that that's contagious? Because obviously, a lot of Democrats don't feel great about life in the United States right now. When you talk to people, when you go to these groups and luncheons, when you have the one-on-one conversations, do you find that optimism is contagious?
I do, and it's perhaps one of the biggest compliments, I guess, that I've received, or the benefits that I've received of this campaign, is when I hear feedback like, "You're the first person to give me hope since Trump was elected." And I think that is amazing, right? It's not just me. I don't think it's necessarily just me, who I am as a person. I think I'm just sort of the conduit. I'm delivering this message of hope. I'm delivering this idea of what could be, right? And I think that's what people want to hear. I know I certainly want to vote for someone who I believe in, who makes me feel like it could happen, not someone who whines or says, well, this is just the way it is. I'm just one person. I'm just one elected, like my opponent says all the time. And, I think to myself, well, only if you were a representative who wanted to fight for the people. You have a platform. You have, all of these ways that you can build coalitions and produce and push for meaningful change, but they're afraid to do it because they're afraid to lose election. They're afraid to lose donors. And that's why I'm not taking any corporate money. I only want to be accountable to my constituents, right? So I'm not afraid to push. Of course, when I win, I'd like to serve for a good few years so we can see meaningful change and then pass that baton to someone who's going to continue that fight. But you know what? If I win and I only serve for 2 years, I'll know that each and every single day I pushed for the change that we so desperately need.
So, since you just brought it up, I'm going to ask you: do you support Do you support term limits for members of Congress?
I do.
You do? Yeah. Good. I think I know the answer to this question, but do you have any regrets running for office, getting into this process?
Nope, not a one.
I have one last question. What are your feelings on the Tara Reade issue?
Oh, yeah, sure. So, I mentioned earlier in this show that I am a survivor of sexual assault. And so by default, I do believe women. I think it's a really terrible conversation that I'm seeing unfold right now, where, folks are just outright dismissing and attacking Tara Reade's allegation as false. I think it's really setting the women's movement back. I don't see Tara Reade's, I think what's happening is some folks are seeing it as an attack on Biden and therefore as an attack on beating Trump. And I don't see it that way. I don't think those things are mutually exclusive. I think that there is a way to let women tell their stories, let women come forward without minimizing their experiences or the experiences of the collective of all survivors. And there needs to be space where we can process it. It doesn't mean that Tara Reade is right and Joe Biden's wrong. It doesn't mean Joe Biden's wrong and Tara Reade is right. It means that we need to honor the experience of survivors here, because the reality is we just don't know. But what I can tell you from a survivor's perspective is that it's very, very, very difficult to come forward and tell your story. It is very painful. It is very, very emotional. And women do not do it lightly. And the amount of folks that come forward, the amount of women who come forward, and men sometimes too, who come forward to share their stories where it is a false accusation is very, very small. But regardless, I think we need to give women the space right now. And I think it's incumbent upon leaders to give them that space, even if, they're falsely accused. It is incumbent upon leaders to give them their space.
So then, following up on that, as a political matter, this is not going to go away because somehow Republicans can get away with everything, including rape, and be unscathed. The same is not true of Democrats. This won't go away because Trump's not going to let this go away. And you can write down the day and time I said this. If it's in his power at all, Tara Reade's mom is going to sit front row in one of these debates. I can promise you that. So as a political reality, do you think it's better for the Democrats to let the party take the bullet here and say, you know what, the party is assaulting Tara Reade, they're suppressing Tara Reade, the party is disgraceful? Or should Joe Biden take the bullet and wade into this thing and get into a he said, she said, and do 3 or 4 interviews on this, which is obviously going to hamper his efforts there? What's the solution here? Because no one's going to be unscathed by this.
No, of course not. And look, I've of course heard the arguments where, well, he's still better than Trump. That's not the question, right? The question is this a credible allegation, and what should be done about it? I don't think any Democrat right now is pleased with the fact that we're essentially going to have to choose between 2 candidates and who has the least amount of sexual assault allegations lobbed against them. But again, this Trump is obviously more dangerous in a lot of ways. And this is, as a survivor, this is a very difficult, choice for me to make. But of course, beating Trump must be done, right? So, but it goes back to not every candidate. Well, in fact, no candidate is perfect. Every single candidate is flawed. And regardless as to whether or not Tara Reade's allegation is true or false, Joe Biden does have a questionable history. And we can talk about time and context and what was socially acceptable and what wasn't. There are a lot of women that aren't happy with Joe Biden for his performance at the Anita Hill hearings, right? The odd behavior with like the hair sniffing and the groping is also not good.
It really is strange, right? I mean, it's so overt when you look at it. It's just bizarre.
It's a little bit bizarre. But you know what? The fact of the matter is a lot of things have changed over time. The fact that we have the internet and folks can be called out in different ways right now. And we do see an environment that is shifting a little bit to be more supportive against women or be more supportive toward women. I think, it's maybe creating a little space for women to come forward. Look, if Joe Biden, what I'd like to see Joe Biden do is be able to have a conversation about that, have a conversation about the collective experience. He's allowed to defend himself. He's allowed to say this didn't happen, but and maybe he does need to wade into it and have this hard, very difficult conversation. It's not an easy conversation to have. It's not easy to give survivors space. There's a lot of trauma there. There's a lot of shame. There's a lot of pain. It's not easy. But if you're running to be the president of the United States and you're running to be that hopeful beacon, maybe that's what survivors need. And I think that that's really all women are asking for. Women are just saying, let's give the space that it is deserved in this particular situation. The Daily Beast wrote an article yesterday or it came out yesterday, where they essentially put two male candidates in the progressive wing on a pedestal for not weighing in on this matter, and then essentially slammed myself and 6 or 7 other female candidates for weighing in on this particular issue, and tried to spin it and say things like, well, many of these candidates supported ultra left candidates, or they're trying to score points, and that kind of behavior, frankly, does to us what this movement is doing to survivors, right? Silencing them, shrugging it off. You can't just shrug off someone's experience. It's not gonna be a winning solution, and it's not the appropriate thing to do, right? Women are speaking out because they're saying, look, you know why we believe women first? Because so many of us have experienced sexual assault, inappropriate behavior, and sexual harassment.
What is that statistic? Is am I correct? That is 1 in 4 women will be sexually assaulted in their life?
Yes.
That's 1 in 4, as in 25% of the population. Okay, yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, that speaks for itself.
Right. And so believing women and believing women first and giving women that space, like, that is not an attack, right, on Joe Biden. It's not. It speaks to a greater movement, a greater shift that needs to happen. And as I said, I think that is why you see so many women and female candidates speak, or at least progressive female candidates speaking up, because we stand with women, because we fight for women, because we want to see this change, because we know it needs to change.
I'm gonna wrap it up. I have one last question, and that is your predictions for 2020 for the White House, the Senate, and the House.
Yes. Well, I'm going to go with my optimistic side again. I do not think Trump will win. I definitely think we will retain the House. I'd like to see and believe that we will pick up many more progressive seats, and I think that we have a good shot at winning the Senate. A good shot. I'm less optimistic at winning the Senate than I am about the other two, but I think if we can, it will. A lot of this will hinge upon the recovery throughout this pandemic, right? I can tell you, as a candidate who is moving into get out the vote, solely based on digital and texting and phone banking operations, it is difficult. But if we can mobilize in the right way, I think that we have a very good shot.
Sasounds good. Well, you have been incredibly gracious to stay here and talk for so long. This has been a great conversation, and I'm not in your district, sadly, but I would vote for you for sure.
Thank you.
Although I can't vote in the primary anyway, I suppose.
That's true.
But that's my cross to bear, I suppose. So just hang on after I stop the recording for a second, sure. and that'll be it. So thanks so much for joining me, and hopefully you'll come back as a congresswoman.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks so much. I'm so grateful that Melanie joined us on the show, but I do want to one more time reiterate very strongly that interview took place weeks ago. That's the reason there was no talk of George Floyd. That's the reason there was no talk of protests. That's the reason police brutality was not the first thing up on the list for that interview. So Melanie put out a fantastic statement on her social media, and you can go find her website as well. And she addresses all of these issues there. And once again, I'm very appreciative she spent her time with us here. Okay, so today's drink. I have a red wine in front of me. I'm a big wine fan, mostly red, although I can be tempted from time to time with a decent white wine. And it also depends on what I'm eating. Today I'm just drinking this standalone. This wine I have in front of me is McBride Sisters Red Blend. Now, firstly, as the label suggests, the owners of this vineyard are sisters, the McBride sisters. What's important about this label and why I chose it for today is this is a black-owned business. There are not enough black-owned distilleries or wineries, obviously. So I want to amplify this a little bit because this also happens to be a good wine. This is a really nice red blend. This really reminds me of sort of the more robust Bordeaux's you would get. This feels like that. It tastes like that, and it feels like that going down. You get the cherries and there's some caramel at the end. Definitely that oaky taste, but there are also, prolific blackberry, blueberry, plum, those sorts of tastes in it. It goes down nicely, it finishes nicely, and it is robust. That's where I keep comparing it to sort of the very assertive Bordeaux's. This is on the acidy side. It's it's on the tannic side. So if you don't like that, maybe this isn't for you. This is not a light red wine. But for me, if I'm eating a big steak, or I'm eating lamb, this is the kind of wine. This is the only type of wine that really would stand up in a big sort of filling, fattening American style meal. This would be a go-to. So McBride Sisters. There are other offerings. There are whites from the vineyard, but this is the red blend, and it's good stuff. 2016 red blend is what I'm drinking. So that's the deal. McBride Sisters red blend. I recommend. Go check it out. Let me know if you do. And finally, I'm going to move on to my final thoughts for today. And then, did I say final thoughts? Wow, that's Jerry Springer. Oh, wow. Probably going to edit that out. Probably not. Nope, I'm not. I said it. I said what I said. I'm going to move on to our last segment today. I have some thoughts to share with you at the end of this program. So they're thoughts that are final. Oh, whatever. All right. So we're going to move on. And then remember to email us at thedrinkersandthinkers@gmail.com and check out all the various social media stuff and YouTube and such. So we can't not talk about what's going on, I suppose, directly. And that is this, the killing of George Floyd and the fallout from that, the killing of hundreds upon hundreds of innocent black Americans. Black lives matter. I'll be unequivocal on that point. Black lives matter. And there's a very powerful thing I heard, and that is that all lives can't matter until black lives matter. I reject the notion of all lives matter as a slogan, as an idea, as a thought, for all the reasons that have been well illustrated by people smarter and more articulate than me, and also well articulated by the internet and memes. It doesn't take a scholar to understand the finer points of this. It simply takes an ignorant person to not quite grasp it. Black lives matter. And they are under constant threat, be it from institutional poverty to institutional racism to the brutality and violence visited upon them by the police. Now, some things worth noting. First of all, black Americans account for 32% of police killings in America. White Americans account for 52%. What idiots will say is that more white people are killed by the police than black. Yes, they are. But where it becomes truly alarming is that white people account for about 65% of the population. Black people account for about 12%. The statistic of 32% of police killings being black men is 3 times their proportional representation in our country. That is not a statistically insignificant number. White people are 65% of the population and 52% of the police killings. Black people are 12% of the population and 3 times that much of police killings. And folks were fixated on the deaths, and we should be. George Floyd was murdered in the street. And we could go through a laundry list of people who have been choked for selling cigarettes, people who were shot because they looked out their window, people who were shot lying in bed, people who were shot in their cars because they informed the officer that they had a legal handgun in the car. We could go through the list of more quote-unquote dubious situations where a lot of white people like to kind of give side-eye and say, well, he did have drugs in the car. Well, he did have on his computer. None of that matters. The police are not empowered. We all, at some point, all agreed to these rules that the police should not be empowered to take matters into their hands like this. I don't care what George Floyd was doing at the convenience store at this point. Makes no difference to me. I don't care if you found 2 kilos of coke in his trunk. Makes no difference to me. None. None at all. For me, the problem isn't just the police killings. And we should know their names, and we should say their names. The problem is much larger, and that's police violence. And violence isn't always just physical. Intimidation is a form of violence. Intimidation is a form of brutality. Bullying is a form of brutality. These are the things. The physical attacks, the intimidation, the bullying, these are the things that go unreported. As the police are so fond of reminding us, if there's no body, there's no crime. It's easy to look at the victims of police murders. We need to look past that. It's not just the people they kill. It's the people that are alive that don't report their stories. The things that happen when there are no body cams and there are no station cameras. The things that happen when they shut off their body cams. The things that happen when they cover up their body cams. The things that happen when they erase the tapes. The things that happen when they all coalesce around each other in a thin blue line of silence. These are the crimes. And it turns 1,500 police killings a year into tens of thousands of acts of police violence every year. There are tens of thousands of reported acts of police brutality and violence. Now, are all of them truthful? No. A criminal has a vested interest in disparaging the officers. Some people will say anything. But are most of them true? Yeah, I do think they are. And I think, forget that most of the reports are true. Most of the acts go unreported. Most of the acts go unreported. I had an incident when I was 20 years old where a cop lost his mind over a wiffle ball game. And some people that might be listening to this right now know exactly what I'm talking about. A Suffolk County Police Department officer lost his mind over a wiffle ball game. Now, this was before camera phones, because I'm old, but this was an incredible incident. Lost his mind. Tried every which way to provoke us into saying the wrong thing or snapping. Blocked our cars so we couldn't leave after he told us to leave, and we were complying. We had put our wiffle ball bat in the trunk, and he objected to the way we put our wiffle ball bat in the trunk. And instead of allowing us to drive away, he got in his car, quickly drove up next to the driver's side door of my car so that I couldn't get in the car, and then proceeded to yell and to scream. Just waiting for me to say something stupid, just waiting for my friends to say or do something stupid. I've seen it firsthand. There's no way that cop was afraid of us. There was no way he was fearing for his life. We hadn't even broken the law. That went unreported, by the way. Because what's the point? What's the point when I say he did this thing? I felt endangered by his police car. I could say in the report, and that would be perfectly valid. The man was unhinged for no reason at all. I could have reported it. I should have reported it, but it would have went nowhere. And I'm a white guy, and I feel the despair of the uselessness, the futility of reporting this act of police misconduct. Imagine how a disenfranchised person would feel. Imagine a person from a sect of society that we already ignore would feel. The futility, the danger of reporting something like that. You know, the police are very good at protecting their own personnel records and protecting their own psych evaluations and protecting their own. But everyone knows who makes these reports. The people that report these things are not protected. Their identities are not protected. There is retaliation in the communities. If you call out a bad cop, you have to fear for yourself. You have to fear for your business. This is the reality. And I try to think, because there's racism all over the world. There's abhorrent racism in the United Kingdom, France, other places that don't experience racial strife, but there are reasons for that. I look to some places like Japan, and I say, well, there's really no racism in Japan, but that's because the entire culture is xenophobic. There is no other in Japanese culture, and that's obviously that's a wrong-headed way of doing things too. And if nothing else, their rapidly declining birth rate tells you what happens when you try and go it alone like that. This goes on all over the world. This racism, this fear of the other, this want to dominate other people. But as far as the police go, it's not surprising that you look at less developed countries and you see corrupt police. I look to Mexico, right next to us. But I really have to rack my brain to think what other places in the world are people in legitimate and constant fear of just routine interaction with the police. I look to authoritarian countries like Russia. It's well known that their police and certain groups within the police go out specifically to assassinate people. Okay? State-ordered assassinations of people. Saudi Arabia does this. We saw this with the journalist, but this happens all the time there. These sort of state-ordered killings. But that's different than just dying in a random encounter with the police, dying at a traffic stop, dying in your own home. And I really have to rack my brain to think where else in the world that this is prevalent. The only one I could come up with that's analogous, and what proud company we're keeping, is the Philippines right now. That's the only one I can think of that a person could be legitimately afraid of just a routine day-to-day interaction with a police officer. This is a country, the Philippines, where their leader, Duterte, basically gleefully sends the police out to gun down people that he views as criminals. This is the only country I can really think of in terms of developed world that this happens. And it's outrageous. And to say it's not a big problem, go one day in a city and try not to see one cop. You can't escape them. They're everywhere. So if you are legitimately afraid, and you should be if you're a minority in America, if you are legitimately afraid of interacting with the police, you cannot escape it in this country. You cannot turn a corner without being reminded that they're there. Nobody, no society should live under that type of constant fear. And it's not just move on from the killings, move on from the police violence. The fear of losing your freedom. The fear that one interaction with the police could land you in a downward spiral of prison. Because one unpaid ticket could do that. One crossword to a police officer could do that. So we have the police killings, the police physical violence, the emotional violence, the bullying and the intimidation, and we have the threat of losing your freedom. Nobody sees a cop and thinks that they're about to have a good day. And that's just a reality of the job. That's just a reality of the job. They're not there when things are good. But what we have in America is a situation in which they're there and it makes things worse. I don't know where we go from here. And I'm unfortunately tend to be cynical or pragmatic, depending on who you ask. I think we're going to be right back to normal in a week or so. I think there'll be some superficial changes made in some police departments, and that'll be that. And we'll all go back about our business and wait till the next outrage. I keep hoping that this is the time, that this is the one. This time it's going to be different. I do. I keep hoping that. Because we can't move into whatever future is in store for us unless we're all going. And we need to resolve, white people need to resolve that we will not move on unless everyone is coming with us. Unless everyone gets to share in whatever great things may await our nation, if ever. And that's the part white Americans have to play in this, is a refusal to move on from this until every person is brought along with us on this American journey. Not just black people, but poor people, immigrants, the sick, the hungry, the mentally ill, the frightened, the refugee. White people need to say, we're not going to get back to normal. We're not going to allow normal anymore until everyone joins this party. And folks, you're either on that train or you're standing in front of the train blocking it. There are only two sides here, the right and the wrong. Well, that's it from me for today. I hope you've don't feel you've wasted the time you've spent with me here. I enjoy doing these. I'm going to continue doing these. Next week, we're going to have a conversation about the immigration experience in America. This will be our first multi-guest panel, so I'm looking forward to that. I hope everyone has a good week. Stay safe, stay healthy. Black Lives Matter. Please think first, drink later, and fight for what's right now. This is Dan. Thanks for joining me. I'll see you all next week.